There comes a moment in every generation when people must look back, not to be trapped by history, but to understand who they are and why they carry the strengths they do. And when we begin that search, when we peel back the layers of human development, culture, and memory, we do not find our beginnings in the polished languages of modern nations. We find them in Africa, long before the world divided itself into borders, before tribes grew into kingdoms and kingdoms grew into empires. There was a continent whose voices shaped the rhythm of humanity. Africa gave birth not only to bodies but to words, to expressions, to the earliest sounds that carried meaning across plains, mountains, rivers, and deserts. That is why, when we speak about African languages today, we are not merely talking about communication, we are talking about the code that unlocked human thought for the first time. These languages are more than vocabulary, they are foundations of the human mind itself. They hold the structure, the evolution, the patterns, and the emotional truths of humanity's first attempts to understand the world. And yet many do not realize how deeply important this is. They do not understand that if you want to know where humanity comes from, if you want to understand the earliest dreams and fears of human beings, if you want to decode the story of human consciousness, you must look at the languages that were spoken before the world was carved up, before voices were suppressed, before cultures were interrupted. Africa's languages hold the key not because they are old, but because they show us how humans first learned to think. When we examine ancient African languages, the clicks, tones, rhythms, patterns, and layered meanings, we see the earliest fingerprints of human creativity. These languages are not simple, they are profoundly complex. They contain systems of sound and thought that existed long before many modern languages were even imagined. And that complexity matters. It tells us that the earliest humans did not stumble through life without understanding. They communicated with nuance, with structure, with emotion, with intention. They developed ways to describe nature, time, spirit, family, work, creation, and survival. They built communities around meaning, not noise. The origins of tone languages, the evolution of grammatical systems, and the use of sound symbolism all trace back to African traditions that have survived thousands of years, despite attempts to silence or erase them. And when we look at what has lasted, when we see a grandmother teaching a child a song in Akan, or a griot reciting a Mandinka story, or a family speaking Swahili, Somali, Zulu, Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof, Amharic, we are witnessing the survival of a knowledge system older than civilization itself. African languages are living fossils carrying inside them a memory of how humanity began to speak, how humanity began to think, how humanity began to name the world around them. They show us that our first words were not the clumsy sounds of an undeveloped species. They were the deliberate, meaningful expressions of people discovering themselves. Learning this changes you, it shifts your view of the context. It changes the way you see yourself if you are a child of Africa or a descendant of the African diaspora. It means your heritage does not begin with tragedy. It begins with genius. It begins with innovation. It begins with the earliest human breakthrough, the ability to express. And what is most powerful is that African languages still carry that energy today. When you speak in an African language, you are not just communicating, you are tapping into a current of human history that predates writing, predates empires, predates every book that has ever been printed. You are speaking with a voice that built the world. That is why losing these languages is not simply losing words. It is losing access to the roots of humanity. It is losing the ability to understand how human beings evolved emotionally and mentally. Because when you silence the first languages, you silence the original map of the human mind. But the beauty of this moment in history is that African languages are rising again. People are reclaiming them. People are learning them. People are recognizing their value. Scholars from every corner of the world, linguists, anthropologists, neuroscientists, are returning to Africa to study these languages because they understand something the world once ignored. If you want to know where we are going, you must understand where we started. African languages hold clues to how humans first formed community. They show how early humans used sound to shape identity, belonging, and memory. They demonstrate how language was not just a tool of survival but a tool of connection. These languages preserve knowledge that was never written down but was carried in the mind, passed from parent to child, from elder to student, from storyteller to audience. And this oral tradition, this deep cultural memory, is one of the most powerful legacies humanity has ever created. It offers answers to questions science still struggles to understand: how humans developed abstract thought, how they processed emotions, how they made meaning from chaos. Every time someone learns an African language, every time they sing an ancestral song, every time they speak a word their ancestors used thousands of years ago, they are unlocking a piece of human origin that exists nowhere else. And here is the truth many people never hear. Understanding African languages is not only for Africans. It is for everyone who wants to understand the human story. It is for everyone who wants to know how we became who we are. Because these languages reveal something humanity desperately needs to remember: that we are connected, that we share beginnings, that we share a history of survival, struggle, creativity, and brilliance. These languages remind us that the first chapters of the human story were written not in stone but in sound. They were spoken before they were carved, sung before they were recorded, remembered before they were archived. And this is why preserving African languages is not just cultural preservation, it is human preservation. When you preserve a language, you preserve a worldview. You preserve a way of understanding time, nature, emotion, and purpose. You preserve the wisdom of people who watched the world from its earliest horizon and interpreted it with clarity and depth. And when you lose a language, you lose a way of thinking that will never return. That is why this message matters today more than ever, because the world is changing fast. Technology grows stronger. Globalization spreads wider. Young people feel pulled away from their roots, pressured to speak the languages of power while abandoning the languages of heritage. But what they do not realize is that the languages they are leaving behind carry the psychological strength they are searching for. They carry identity. They carry resilience. They carry belonging. They carry the blueprint of a people who survived every storm the world threw at them. African languages are not obstacles to progress. They are guides to the future. They teach patience, humility, community, and balance. They teach how to listen, how to remember, how to connect. They teach how to stand firmly in who you are. And when a people stand in their identity, nobody can break them. Because identity is the greatest armor a human being can wear. So if you are African or a descendant of the African diaspora or someone who simply loves truth, I want you to understand this with clarity. The languages of Africa are not disappearing. They are awakening. They are calling people back to themselves. They are reminding the world where humanity began. They are offering answers the world still needs about unity, about consciousness, about origin, about purpose. And one day when people speak of human beginnings, they will speak not only of bones and fossils, but of the words that carried humanity forward. They will speak of the languages that shaped the mind, the languages that whispered the first hopes, the languages that built the world long before it knew its own name. And when they do, Africa will stand not as a footnote to history but as its foundation, the place where language was born, where identity began, and where humanity first learned to understand itself. If you want to know where humanity began, listen to the first voices that shaped the human mind. They were African, echoing across landscapes long before the world learned how to write its own story. These voices were not only spoken through mouths, they were expressed through rhythm, movement, symbols, sounds, and the coded patterns of communication that allowed the earliest humans to build societies, pass knowledge, and create meaning. When we talk about language, we often imagine alphabets and dictionaries, but long before those ever existed, Africa was shaping the very foundations of human expression. The tone, the melody, the cadence of early speech rose from these lands, woven into the fabric of communities that learned to thrive by sharing understanding from one generation to another. There is something profoundly powerful about knowing that the origins of communication began with people who carried nothing but hope, survival, and imagination. And the words they shaped did not die, they evolved. They branched, they migrated with travelers and wanderers, and they became the foundation for countless languages across the globe. To understand the journey of language is to understand the journey of humanity itself, because the first stories ever told were born in Africa. When ancestors gathered around fire, when hands carved symbols into rocks, when elders taught children through song and chant, they were constructing something far deeper than simple conversation. They were building identity, they were designing memory, they were forming the emotional and intellectual blueprint that would guide humanity for tens of thousands of years. The beautiful truth is that African languages still contain some of the world's oldest linguistic structures, the oldest tonal systems and the richest sound patterns. They carry clues about how humans first learned to organize their thoughts, how they formed communities, and how they shaped the earliest cultures. Every syllable, every tone, every rhythmic pattern echoes across thousands of generations, holding the whispers of the past like a living museum. When people hear African languages today, many do not realize that they are listening to one of humanity's earliest technologies, the technology of communication. Just as fire transformed how humans lived, and stone tools shaped how humans survived, language shaped how humans thought. It unlocked imagination, emotion, memory, and creativity. It is no exaggeration to say that without the languages developed in ancient Africa, the human species would not have progressed the way it did. The reason humanity spread across the world is because it carried with it the power of communication first mastered by African societies. That is why researchers often say, if you want to understand where human intelligence began, study African speech. If you want to understand why humans developed art, music, and storytelling, study the societies that first used language to pass down knowledge long before there were books. And if you want to understand how humans became human, listen to the first voice. Those early voices were not shaped by fear or division. They were shaped by unity and survival. People lived closely together, learned from the land, and developed languages that reflected not only their needs, but their environment, their emotions, and their dreams. This connection between language and identity is one of the reasons African languages hold so much depth. They are not simply ways to communicate, they are ways to be. They embody culture, worldview, respect, and community. The way a word is spoken often carries as much meaning as the word itself. The tone, the rhythm, the inflection, all of it communicates something deeper, something that traces back to the dawn of time. When you listen to these languages today, you are not just hearing sound. You are hearing the survival of a people who, through centuries of migration, struggle, colonization, and displacement, refused to let their voices die. It is important to understand that the world did not always value these voices. History tried to silence them, empires tried to erase them, colonizers attempted to replace them with new alphabets, new tongues, and new cultural systems. Yet despite that, African languages survived. They survived in the villages, in the markets, in the songs, in the rituals, in the names passed down from parents to children. Even in the diaspora, fragments of African language survived. In accents, in rhythm, in grammar patterns, in expressions, in the very music that Black people around the world create. The languages of the ancestors traveled across oceans, hidden within memory, preserved through resistance, encoded in culture. When Black people in the diaspora speak today, they may not even realize how much of their linguistic style comes from Africa. The strategic pauses, the tonal shifts, the storytelling cadence, all of it is a continuation of something ancient, something unbroken, something powerful. This is why African languages matter so deeply today. They are not relics, they are keys that unlock a clearer understanding of human origins, human psychology, human evolution, and human connection. When we look at global languages today, whether English, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, or others, we find deep-rooted similarities in structure, tone, or sound patterns that trace back to the earliest human communication systems in Africa. Scholars studying linguistics often discover that the earliest branches of the world's language families originate in Africa, suggesting that the human voice first learned to shape meaning on this continent. The world learned to speak because Africa first spoke. The world learned to organize thought because Africa first created the blueprint. And the world learned to tell stories because African ancestors first understood that stories were the soul's way of remembering. When you embrace this truth, something powerful happens. The way you see yourself changes. You realize that you come from a history that predates empires, predates nations, predates every written scripture or philosophy. You come from people who shaped the beginnings of human understanding. You come from minds that unlocked the world's first languages. This knowledge is not just academic, it is transformative. It grounds you, it strengthens you, it reminds you that identity is not only shaped by the present, but strengthened by the roots of the past. Language is one of the strongest ties to ancestry, and understanding its origins gives you a deeper understanding of yourself. So when someone asks where humanity began, tell them it began with the first voice. When someone asks who shaped human thought, tell them it was the ancient African mind. And when someone asks why African languages matter, tell them because they hold the secrets of who we were, who we are, and who we can become. African languages don't just tell stories. They reveal the blueprint of how humans first learned to think, feel, and connect. And when you begin to explore them deeply, you start to realize that they carry within them the earliest fingerprints of human consciousness itself. Every tone, every rhythm, every symbol carved into ancient walls or spoken around village fires is more than communication. It is a record of how early humans shaped their worldview and how they passed that worldview down through generations long before writing existed. When you listen carefully, you discover that African languages hold structures that are older than some civilizations, reflecting how the human mind first organized meaning, how communities formed shared memory, and how people transformed experience into culture. These languages didn't just emerge, they evolved alongside humanity, growing as people learned to farm, organize, travel, trade, worship, and solve the problems of living. They store ancient knowledge in metaphors, proverbs, tonal shifts, and cultural references that survived centuries of displacement, colonization, and migration, proving that language is not just sound, it is a container of identity. In many African languages, a single word can carry multiple layers of meaning, teaching us that early human communication was rich, symbolic, and deeply connected to the environment. You see it in the way words relate to nature, seasons, animals, and emotions, showing how early societies interpreted the world long before modern science attempted to describe it. When you explore languages like Khoisan with its clicks, Yoruba with its tonal musicality, Igbo with its deeply encoded philosophical structure, or Swahili with its melodic openness, you begin to understand that these are not just means of expression, they are living fossils of humanity's earliest attempts to understand existence. They show that the first humans were not primitive but deeply intuitive thinkers who built systems of expression that were flexible enough to adapt through centuries yet sturdy enough to survive despite oppression and forced assimilation. And when African languages were attacked, banned, or replaced, it wasn't just words that were lost, it was memory, worldview, intellectual heritage, and ancestral knowledge. But what is remarkable is that even after centuries of attempts to erase them, these languages remain whispering truths that the world is only now beginning to revisit. They teach us that human connection began with shared meaning, shared emotion, shared rhythm, and shared spirituality, not in the religious sense but in the sense of understanding one another on a human level. African languages show us that early humans valued community deeply. They developed words that describe relationships, cooperation, empathy, and collective identity long before individualism became a global standard. And the way these languages map family, clan, and community reveals how early humans balanced responsibility, heritage, and social harmony. They also reveal migration patterns showing how groups moved, settled, mixed, and preserved pieces of their identity, even as they adapted to new languages. When scientists study African languages today, they see how humans first categorized the world, how they defined time and space, how they formed the foundations of art, music, storytelling, and even early science. These languages are keys to understanding how the first humans observed the stars, tracked seasons, measured distance, and described the mysteries of life. And for the African diaspora, reclaiming these languages represents more than cultural pride. It is a reconnection to the original human blueprint. It is a reminder that identity is not rooted in trauma or struggle alone. It is rooted in brilliance, innovation, and ancient intelligence. As these languages are resurrected through education, technology, and cultural revival, they become bridges not just to Africa's past, but to humanity's shared past. They teach us that to understand where we are going, we must understand where we came from, and African languages hold the deepest and oldest chapters of that story. They show that humanity's first voice came from this continent, and that voice is still alive, still powerful, still echoing with truths the world is finally ready to hear. Every African word spoken today is a living memory from the dawn of humanity, a code that carries within it the echoes of the first people who walked this earth, thought deeply about life, and tried to make sense of their surroundings. When someone speaks an African language, Even in its modern form, they are holding in their mouth fragments of sounds that may have been spoken tens of thousands of years ago. Long before borders, long before colonization, long before the world was divided into nations and races. Each word, each tone, each structure represents a decision made by ancient minds how to describe the sun, how to express sorrow, how to call for help, how to honor elders, how to celebrate birth, or how to explain the mysteries of the night sky. Human history is not only recorded in fossils and artifacts, it is recorded in speech and rhythm, in the way sound patterns carry meaning. Many African languages preserve some of the oldest linguistic features ever found, such as click consonants, tonal patterns, and symbolic word constructions that reveal how the first humans shaped communication. When you listen closely, you can hear layers of meaning that go far beyond vocabulary. You hear how early humans interpreted the world through their senses, how they connected nature with human behavior, how they embedded wisdom into proverbs, how they used stories to teach values long before there were written books. These languages evolved through countless generations who passed them down orally, carefully preserving the emotional truth and cultural memory of each word. And that is why every African language spoken today is not just a tool for conversation, it is a container of humanity's earliest cognitive patterns. The structure of these languages reveals how the first communities understood time, identity, and belonging. Some languages have intricate ways of marking respect, showing how deeply early societies valued elders and the relationships that held families together. Others carry built-in metaphors that reflect humanity's oldest relationship with nature, where mountains, rivers, trees, and animals were not just objects but symbols that connected people to their environment. Even the musicality of many African languages, where pitch can change meaning entirely, shows how the earliest humans blended sound, emotion, and meaning in ways that modern linguistics is still trying to fully understand. When a person speaks Yoruba, Swahili, Igbo, Amharic, Zulu, Wolof, Shona, or any of the thousands of African languages, they are tapping into a memory that predates written history. They are unconsciously recalling the rhythm of their ancestors' footsteps, the patterns of early storytelling, the harmony of communal living, and the ancient wisdom carried through generations. Many of these languages survived attempts to erase them because they were deeply woven into daily life in greetings, songs, rituals, humor, and even the way people prayed for rain or celebrated harvest. Colonization tried to silence them, slavery tried to destroy them, modern globalization tries to overshadow them, yet they remain resilient because they are rooted not just in culture but in human origin. And when African people reclaim or preserve their languages, they are not only protecting cultural identity, they are safeguarding the oldest knowledge system in human history. Linguists around the world study African languages not out of curiosity alone, but because these languages help answer profound questions about how humans first communicated abstract ideas, how they categorized the world, and how they formed societies capable of cooperation and innovation. These languages help researchers trace migration patterns, showing where people moved, how they mixed with other groups, and how they adapted to changing landscapes. Every sound carries a clue, every grammatical structure tells a story, every idiom reveals a worldview shaped long before modern civilization. And the more you explore these languages, the clearer it becomes that they hold the key to understanding not only African heritage but the entire human journey. They remind us that humanity began with community, with shared meaning, with storytelling, with spoken wisdom passed from elders to children. They remind us that before there were cities and borders and written records, there were voices echoing across valleys and plains, shaping the foundation of human thought. So when an African word is spoken today, whether in a home, a classroom, a marketplace, or a distant diaspora community, it is not merely sound. It is a surviving piece of the world's oldest conversation, a living code that explains where we come from, how we evolved, and how deeply connected we all are to the same ancient beginning.